We're going to finish up the portion of this unit on the spinal cord today when we're going to talk about something that actually exists in the brain and then continues into the spinal cord, and that is going to be the ventricles of the brain. Now, technically this is in the brain, so we're getting into the brain at this point, but it's continuous with the spinal cord, so it kind of tags along at the end of that portion. So what is a ventricle? A ventricle is essentially an open area. So it's like a sinus. So we have sinuses in our skull. We talked about that a little bit in the skeletal unit. Well, our brain is mostly solid material. It's made up of the neuroglial cells that we talked about. It's made up of neurons. There's a lot of fat. It's actually a lot of fat in the brain because of all the myelin and also the fact that the brain uses so much energy. So there's a lot of fat in there, but it's not solid. There's actually some areas that are open space, and those are called ventricles. And there's actually 4 ventricles. So I'm going to go through those now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how the cerebral spinal fluid passes through this system that exists. So let's get rolling. So what is a ventricle? A ventricle is very simply these interconnected cavities that are in the brain. So, if I have my brain model right here, if I were to slice the brain in half, the sagittal cut here, and we would take a look inside, you would find that there's this area right here in the middle, which is going to be an open space. It's actually an open area. And it's going to be surrounded by, and actually the membrane of that is going to be those ependymal cells we talked about. The ependema, I said it lines this like open area in the brain. This is what I was talking about. These are the ventricles. So essentially there's 4 of them. They are continuous with each other, which means they're all connected, and they're actually continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. So when I talked about the spinal cord, I mentioned that in the middle of the gray matter, right in the middle of that gray commissure, there is this open canal that travels down the middle of the spinal cord. That is what I'm talking about here. And then it actually connects with the subarachnoid space, which surrounds the brain. And the ventricles and all these spaces that I'm talking about are full of cerebral spinal fluid. And this cerebral spinal fluid flows from the center of the brain where the ventricles are, down the spinal cord and back up and around the sides. But I'm going to get into that in more detail as we go through. First off, there are 4 ventricles. And the 4 ventricles are going to be, the first and the second are the main ventricles. They're considered the lateral ventricles. And they are to either side of the midline. So if you imagine that this is the center of your brain here, like if this is the center of the midline, they're going to be on either side of the midline, and they're the largest ventricles. So if you look at this image here, these are the lateral ventricles. There's one on the right hemisphere, and there's one in the left hemisphere. And that is where cerebral spinal fluid is actually produced, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. So we have the first 2 ventricles are called the lateral ventricles, and they are going to be the 2 main ventricles that are going to be on either side of the midline. And then those 2 are connected to this, what's considered the central or the 3rd ventricle. And then finally you have a 4th ventricle, which is down here in the brain stem. So if I were to point out where those are on my model here, this is the lateral ventricle right here. That's that larger lateral ventricle. And then the 3rd ventricle is going to be right below it. And then the 4th ventricle is going to be right here next to the cerebellum in that space right there. And basically what they are just open cavities where the cerebral spinal fluid can pool up. So let's talk a little bit more about that. But in this diagram here, you have your lateral ventricles, the 3rd, and then the 4th ventricle is right here. And one thing I do want to point out to you is it is continuous with the central canal. So this is the central canal right here. So they're all connected to each other. This is just another diagram of the same thing. These are the lateral ventricles. So we have 2 lateral ventricles, one on each side of the midline. That's why they're called lateral, because there's one on each side. Remember, there's medial, which is in the middle, lateral is to the outside, and they're a little bit to the outside. We have our 3rd ventricle, which is right in the middle, and then our 4th ventricle is down here where the cerebellum is, and then as you can see, that is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. Now, the pathway of cerebral spinal fluid. I'm going to go through this. I'm not going to hold you accountable. I'm not going to ask you on a test, what is the pathway of cerebral spinal fluid? I don't need you to know all the names of the different components, but I do want you to have a basic understanding of what's going on and the different major components that are involved. So I'm just going to explain it, and then we'll see how this goes. So first of all, cerebral spinal fluid is produced in the lateral ventricles. So they're produced in the lateral ventricles by these ependymal cells. And there's also this structure called the choroid plexus. And a choroid plexus is reddish in color. cerebrospinal fluid is not blood, but it's pulled from the blood. We still don't really understand exactly the relationship there. And when I say we, I mean the world of science. And one thing I want to be clear on is I am a high school anatomy teacher. I am not on the front lines of research. There are probably some huge discoveries that have been made that I don't know about. So, if you have some, when you get to college and you talk to some professors, there's probably a much better understanding of this. But at this point, the understanding in terms of where I'm at, the choroid plexuses are these structures that are inside the ventricles that pull fluid from the blood vessels and secrete it into the ventricle. And that substance, that liquid that fills up the ventricle is called is cerebrospinal fluid. So it works like a fountain, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, I'm not going to hold you responsible for this terminology, but I'm going to just talk through it. I don't need you to know the names of the foramen that pass this fluid through, but I'm just going to talk through it. So basically, the lateral ventricles is where this fluid starts. It's produced in this area here. Then gravity takes over, and gravity pulls things downwards. So it pulls up in this area, and as it fills up, it's going to overflow, and it's going to travel through into the third ventricle. It's going to go down to the third ventricle through this opening called the interventricular foramina. But again, I'm not going to hold you responsible for that term. And then it's going to pull up into the third ventricle, where it's going to fill up that area, and then it's going to go through the cerebral aqueduct, which is another thin opening, and it's going to pull up in the fourth ventricle, in this area here. And then it's going to travel down this canal here. So I want to just give you a little analogy, because I love analogies. So you've all seen a fountain before, right? And a fountain works on a pretty simple principle, gravity. So essentially the fountain starts, water comes out of the fountain, right? It gets pumped out and it fills up this first basin here. And then once it overflows, it's going to overflow into the basin below it until that fills up with water. And then that, of course, is going to flow down into the basin below it, and that's going to fill up with water. But what ends up happening here is this water is then going to get pumped right back up to the top to continue the process. It's the same water in a fountain being recycled. It's not like they're adding water constantly. It's just recycling the same water. And that is essentially how it works with the cerebrospinal fluid. It starts up in the brain. So, if I draw the brain here, that's a brain, believe it or not. And then in the middle, we have our ventricles. So what's going to happen is we have our first, our second, third, and fourth. And then that's going to be connected to the central canal. This looks terrible, but you get the point. So it's going to fill up here. It's going to travel to the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle, and then it's going to go all the way down the spinal cord, which is what I'm going to talk about next. But I want you to have this image of a fountain when you're thinking about, what I'm talking about here. All right, let me just keep going here with the content, and we will finish up this lecture. Okay, so at this point, I talked about the fact that it's going to travel to the fourth ventricle, and then it hits this central canal. So what happens next? It flows into the central canal, it goes down to the bottom of the spinal cord, to the conus medullaris, and then it comes back up the sides. So if you think about my fountain analogy, it's going to fill up, it's going to travel down to the bottom of the spinal cord to the base where the conus medullaris is, and then it's going to come, because of gravity, it's got nowhere to go, so it's going to come back up the side. So you can see here to the outside, this is the outside path of the cerebral spinal fluid. So it's going to travel up into this area here and up and around and back in again. So that's what it says here. It flows into the central canal and then the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord, and then back up to that subarachnoid space around the brain. And then what ends up happening at this point is it has to get reabsorbed. So it gets reabsorbed into these little structures called arachnoid granulations or arachnoid villi. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see these little outgrowths that pop out. Now this is arachnoid mater that goes out into the space, this space between the dura, into that subarachnoid space. It comes up into that, and what these little things are, they're like little sponges, these little arachnoid villi, and they absorb the excess cerebrospinal fluid and put that fluid back into the blood supply. So it drains it into the blood supply. So this detail here is a pretty interesting one. It gives you an idea of how much fluid is being absorbed and why we need to always be absorbing it. So we produce about 500 milliliters of cerebral spinal fluid a day. So about half, half of a liter, really. So it's a good amount of fluid. That's a lot of liquid. And only about 150 milliliters of this fluid is in the central nervous system at any time. So that means 350 milliliters are being absorbed. So more is being absorbed than produced. So you're always making it, but you're always absorbing it. And what that does is it keeps a nice balance of pressure on the brain. Now, if there's too much cerebral spinal fluid, that's going to cause pressure on the brain, similar to a subdural hematoma. And if there's not enough cerebral spinal fluid, the brain's actually going to expand, just like pressure changes occur, and that's going to cause issues. So you really need to have the right amount. Now, what is CSF? What is cerebral spinal fluid? It's essentially, it's the clear fluid, and what it does, it really has two main jobs that we know of. The first one is it provides protection for the brain. It's this fluid that surrounds it and protects it from impact. It keeps it buoyant in the skull, in the cranium, but it also nourishes it. So it provides ions that are necessary. This is not blood, so it doesn't provide oxygen or sugar. It provides ions for neuron function. So just to review what I went over today, there are 4 ventricles in the brain. There's the lateral ventricles that are going to be the main ventricles when you think of ventricles, and they are going to be to either side of the midline. There's the third ventricle that is just below it, right? And then there's going to be the fourth ventricle, which is right before the end of the brainstem and the beginning of the spinal cord. And then we have our central canal. So what happens here is we have our choroid plexus, which is this tissue that is going to be in the ventricle, and that produces cerebral spinal fluid. It's where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced, and that then leads to the circulation of the cerebral spinal fluid, where that first ventricle and second ventricle fill up with fluid. Gravity pulls it downwards to the third ventricle, to the fourth ventricle, and then eventually it makes its way to the central canal of the spinal cord. It travels all the way down to the bottom of the central canal, to the conus medullaris, and then it comes back up the sides of the brain and all the way back up the spinal cord. So the entire spinal cord on the outside and then right down the middle is full of the cerebral spinal fluid. And then that cerebral spinal fluid is going to travel up and around the brain, back up to the top, essentially, where we have these arachnoid villi or arachnoid granulations, and they reabsorb the cerebral spinal fluid and put it back into the system. So just like a fountain reuses the same water, so does our cerebral spinal fluid. There's going to be more being made, but it's coming from that same source. Thank you very much.